who just wants to fill my desires, those negative attributes create vilonot, create mechitzot between me and God. And to experience God, which is what a Navi does, a Navi experiences God on some level, but to experience God, one needs to push away and remove those mechitzot and allow a person to be close with God. And therefore he says, this is what he talks about, mechitzot, havilon v'inyanehem. And what he talks about in this perek is that Harbei matzeh b'midrashot u'ba'agadot are meaning from the beginning. A lot is found in the Medrash, in the Agadah, v'gam b'Talmud. Sheyesh bein hanavim mi sheyira ha'elokim me'achurei mechitzot vilon rabot. There are people who only experience God from behind a lot of mechitzot. U'beinehem, and there are those mi sheyiru me'acharei mechitzot vilon muatot. Those who see or experience God, they're not seeing God, experience God through less. The more it's shrouded, interesting word, the more the nevuah is shrouded in different kinds of terms as opposed to being direct, the more vilonot that there might be, the more mechitzot. Hakol lefi kirvatam el ha'elokim virum mikomam, all according to the closeness with God and their level. Ad sha'amru, until they said, Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom ra'at Elokim, Moshe, who is the Avi HaNevi'im, he saw God me'achurei mechitza achat me'ira, the kolomar shkufa. Moshe just had the thinnest of curtains, of veils, in between him and God. Moshe was on that level that he had perfected and himself in terms of his midot and in terms of his yidi'ah, his chokhmah, to a point where there were no separations, only the thinnest of separations that existed between him and God. Then it said, "V'hu amram histakel." He saw, this is what the Lashon Chazal, aspaklaria ha'me'ira, that he was able to see God through almost a completely transparent a venue, like a mirror, not mirror. Interesting. The aspaklaria shem hamar'eh hana'asit miguf shakuf kividolach ukizchuchit. Something which is sheer, which is transparent. Ukemosh neva'er besof kelim, as I'll explain in also in the Mishnah Torah. And what he basically says that the ma'alot, and whether they're ma'alot of chokhmah, I'm not going to read it all the ma'alot of midot, are mechitzot. Ve'elu ha'pchituyot, kulam hem ha'mechitzot ha'mavdilot bein ha'adam u'bein ha'elokim. These are the mechitzot which separate between man and God. And he brings proofs to that. And he says to be a Navi, one has to reach a level where they remove a lot of the mechitzot. The person who's not on this level, again, how Bilam, which is a whole separate discussion, how a person like Bilam had nevuah. And Bilam, we say, was a Rasha who was a chamdan, who wanted worldly possessions. Doesn't seem to be someone who was a great Baal Midot, the way he's described by Chazal. There could be situations where God, for certain reasons, gave certain people because of a situation. The Rambam is talking in general here. He's not getting into, and I'm not going to get into, how one deals with the anomalies, which were just, it says that everyone at the Kriyat Yamsuf, at Ma'amad Har Sinai, the Shifcha Alayam, the person who was a maidservant, a slave, a person who was not an upper learned or most refined person, Ra'u Mashalo Ra'a Yechezkel Ben Buzi, that what they saw at Matan Torah, their level of nevuah was they experienced God in a way that the Navi Yechezkel, and why does it choose Yechezkel? Because Yechezkel, we know, He is one in his nevuah. He talks about the Ma'aseh Merkavah. The Ma'aseh Merkavah is the chariot of God, so to speak, a description of God's throne and presence. The chariot of God. That Yechezkel, the Ma'aseh Merkavah is a sublime and very difficult to understand nevuah. So it says the least refined person in Yetziat Mitzrayim experienced that which Yechezkel did not experience. So there were times, and again, the Rambam is not addressing this here, but apparently there are times when God could, for a certain reason, based upon the particulars of a certain situation or a time or a reason, bestow nevuah on someone who hasn't necessarily reached that level. I mean, these were people who just left Mitzrayim, who were not, all the, even though we learn that the time from Yetziat Mitzrayim till Matan Torah, the Jews elevated themselves and reached higher levels from going from Pesach till Shavuot. But still, one would imagine that these people were not necessarily on such a level that they would achieve the nevuah, and yet they were given that nevuah. But in general, the Rambam is saying to achieve nevuah, a person has to remove these mechitzot, and these mechitzot are having wrong wisdom, which is not straight, and midot, which are not straight. And that's why he brings down here, Ein nevuah shoreh ela al chacham gibor ve'ashir. It says that nevuah only comes to someone who is wise, strong, and wealthy. And the Rambam explains very clearly that this is not talking about how many wrestling matches you win or how much money you have in the bank, but when it's referring to wealthy and strong, it's referring to wealthy and strong the way the Pirkei Avos describes it. Ashir is histapkut, someone who is happy what they have. Ezehu ashir hasameach b'chelko, ezehu gibor hakovesh et yitzro. That's what it's referring to, that it says nevuah only rests upon a person that has these developed character traits because the mechitzot are pushed away. And therefore he explains how some of the Nevi'im who did have, nobody was perfect, and they did have certain issues which hampered or caused certain mechitzot to get in the way of nevuah. And that's the way he also explains later the Chazal, kol ha'ko'es, anybody who gets angry, im navihu nevuato mistaleket mimenu. If he's a navi, he loses his nevuah, because once you demonstrate that anger and you have that puts down a mechitzah between you and God. And that's why a person has to be besimcha, and that's why Shaul or various, or Elisha the Navi, were angry. V'atakichuli min again, they used music to put them in to be mesir, to move away the bad feelings, the bad midos which were creeping in. And whether it's atzvut also, it says that all the years that Yaakov thought that Yosef was not living, he didn't have nevuah. It says Vatechi ruach Yaakov avihem. It says in this coming week's parsha that when he finally heard that Yosef was alive, his spirit became alive. And Chazal say Vatechi ruach, that he had ruach nevuah, that all those years that he was be'atzvut. And again, atzvut is also, the Rambam puts it as a negative character trait. The person's supposed to be besimcha. Again, simcha doesn't mean jolly. Simcha doesn't mean atzvut. Simcha means an inner simcha, which Yaakov couldn't have as long as he was in a state of sadness and depression over Yosef's being missing. And therefore, the Rambam says that also the Moshe Rabbeinu had that mechitzah shekufa. Moshe Rabbeinu was in a situation where he really was the closest, and he had only the thinnest of veils, because he had perfected himself above and beyond. I want to just explain one thing which I think is very important. The Rambam refers to Moshe as the Av HaNeviim, the father of all Nevi'im. And there's really two important aspects to this. One aspect which he's talking about here, and one aspect which he's not talking about here, which in a way may be more significant. And a father of all Nevi'im could mean that he was on a higher level than all Nevi'im. That's the way most people would understand it. He saw God through only the thinnest of separations. He experienced God in the most direct way, and therefore he was the father of all the Nevi'im. The Rambam elsewhere explains that the father of Nevi'im, of all Nevi'im, means something a lot more than that. It means something different. How do we know to listen to a Navi? How do we know that a Navi who fits certain criteria that of a Navi emes, not a Navi sheker, and those criteria, the Rambam brings them down in a very specific form, very specific criteria, not just somebody who tells the future 90% of the time is a Navi. A Navi who fills these criteria, we listen to them as this is the word of God. This is a Navi. There's a mitzvah. One needs to listen to the Navi. A Navi is Navi emes, not a Navi sheker. Where do we get this from? How do we know this? A Navi could, let's say a person, how do we know you listen to a Navi? There was something which was unique about Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. And it wasn't just that it was on the highest level. At Matan Torah, God spoke to Moshe in the presence of the nation. That means the nation looked on or experienced it. They were there when God spoke to Moshe. They saw that God communicates to his Navi. And they saw that God spoke to Moshe, and that they knew beyond any doubt that Moshe's nevuah was real and was emes. Moshe then told the nation that from God that any Navi who fits these criteria, you need to listen to them as you listen to me. So the source of the authenticity of all Nevi'im is the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. So when we talk about Moshe being the father of all Nevi'im, it's not merely that his nevuah was greater. It's that the source of the believability that we have is because we experienced, we saw, we were there when God spoke to Moshe, and therefore we know it was authentic, and that which Moshe passes on, we know came from this authentic source. So it's a very significant thing, which is lost, I think, sometimes, that when we talk about and use the expression Moshe Haya Av HaNevi'im, it's like a Av and Toladot, like almost by the Melachot of Shabbos, where there's the Av and a Toladah. There's the Av means it's an outgrowth of his nevuah. The reason to believe and the authentic nature of every Navi is an outgrowth of Moshe's nevuah. So that's what it means. At any rate, getting back to this, Moshe saw b'mechitza shkufa, and he just had the thinnest of veils, and that's what he yearned. Once he saw that he had that, he said to God, let me, I'm almost there. Let me see it all. Let me experience, remove even this thinnest of veils. Kasher yada Moshe Rabbeinu, shelo nish'ar lo masach, shelo kira'o, that there was no masach, there was no screen, which was not ripped down. V'chi nimshalu ma'alot hamidot kulan v'hama'alot hadiburiot kulan, that he ruled over all, he basically got to the right place in the ma'alot hamidot and the ma'alot hadiburiot, which are chachma. Bikesh lahasig et ha'elokim ba'amitat metziuto, acha shelo nish'ar monea. Osa sha amar, and that's when he turned to God and he said, Hareini na es kivodecha. Let me see your full glory. He yearned to know God. There's a mitzvah the Rambam talks about, the idea that we want to, a person should develop a yearning to, we want to be close to a great person, lahavdil, or to a greatness. We want to be, when we recognize the greatness of God, we should feel a yearning, and We want to develop a yearning to know him, to be close to him. And so he said to God, Hareini na'as kivodecha, v'hodio bo yisbarach, and God let him know. He said, no, she'efshar lo l'davar zeh, you can't get this. Lihiyoto, and this is so significant, lihiyoto shekol nimtza b'chomer. Seichel nimtza b'chomer, I'm sorry. Because you're attached to physicality, and because God is so separate from anything physical, you can't, while you are attached, while our neshama resides in a physical body, no matter how much we've purified and cleansed that physical body, and we've exalted that physical body, it's still part of a physical body. And while it's still part of that physical body, we can't experience God fully. Ritzoni lomar ba'asher Adam, while you are Adam, he said to him, while you are alive, you can't experience me. That's what he said. Kilo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai. That pasuk is not just, you can't, if I, it's like, it almost sounds like, if I tell you, I'll have to kill you. Kilo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai. You can't see me and live. But think about it, what it really means. What is v'chai? V'chai means that your neshama is residing in the physical body. That's life. When a person dies, their niftar is the expression we use. The neshama leaves the physical body. Nothing happens to it other than it separates. So that's the niftar. But as long as it is mechubar, as long as our neshama is part of the physical body, lo yirani ha'adam, while you're attached to physicality, you can't fully get me. You can't fully experience me. And that's what he said to him. And that's, even though you have this, you can't fully experience me. And that's why there has to remain some kind of mechitza always between us. And that's why he says, V'ra'ita et achorai. You'll see my back, which is, you can recognize someone from the back, not completely. Sometimes you can mistake someone. It's not a full recognition and a full understanding. And that's why the pasuk uses that expression. It's a metaphor that you can see my back and you can know me in a way that a person can know someone from the back, but not in a way that you know someone from the front. From the front, if you really see someone from the face, you won't mistake them with someone else. You'll really know them. And that's what he talks about in this seventh parak. This particular topic. And last and final parak, the Rambam talks about the parak Shmini, which is not short. And again, we're not going to read. We'll just read small portions of it. This parak is, in my mind, just super significant for life here. He really he wraps up certain things and finishes it up, and he really lets us know what our charge is before tackling Masechet Avot, before seeing his Perush and learning Pirkei Avot. And his basic points here, which he starts with and he develops in this parak, I would say is human responsibility. It's a way I would really summarize it in 2 words. He says that a person it's a basic belief. It has to be our basic belief and understanding, and it has its questions, philosophical questions. We can spend, and people could do it better than I can do it, philosophers, to understanding and delving into the meaning and of free choice, of Bechira Chofshit. But what the Rambam says clearly is that Bechira Chofshit is it's a basic foundation of our belief that we have free choice. He says, it's impossible that a person is born mitchilat inyano b'teva, lo bal yitaron v'lo bal chesron. A person is born with a clean slate. Just like a person is not going to be born an architect, or some Jewish parents want their kids think that their kids are born doctors, but you can't be born a doctor. We have to learn it. They have to, just like a person can't be born knowing a trade, the person is not born being a certain way. אבל אפשר שיוולד בטבע מוכן למעלה ובחיתות. We could be born with a proclivity. We could be born with an netiya to certain midos. באופן שיהיו מעשים הללו קלים או יותר ממעשים אחרים. We could be born with a certain netiya to being a kind person, or to being an angry person, or to being a person who enjoys physical pleasure, or the opposite. We could be born with leanings, but to say that we're born a certain way, that we are this way, the Rambam negates. Mashal hazeh, adam shemizgonoteh yoter al hayovesh, ve'etzem mocho zach, v'haratifut me'ateh bo. A person, they talked in terms sometimes of liquid and dry. Greek philosophers would talk about the four basic elements that were more, if your body was had more lechut and more dryness and more of this, so you had an intiyah to this midah. But just work around that. A person who's basically, what he's saying is that if a person could be born with a pull or a proclivity to a certain midos. Lo lizkor lahavin anyanim yoter meish bal gami. It's easier for him to understand things. A person who's more yavesh, they're more cerebral. So it's easier for them to understand things from a person who's more emotional and not cerebral. Sharativut b'mocho rabba. Avlim ya'azvu et hamuchan shemizgo lemala zu. But if he doesn't pursue it, you can have people who are, born with an ability for intellectual pursuits, and they never pursue them. Sometimes you think about people in different generations. We have everybody, we have opportunities, and people go to colleges, and people have all kinds of degrees and masters and doctorates. And some of the people are very smart, and some may not be. And there are some people who could have achieved tremendous things intellectually, but they were born in circumstances where it was more difficult for them. And some of them still achieved, and some of them, weren't able to maximize that potential. But in reality, the Rambam says it's potential. It's all potential. People are born with different potentials. He's not saying everyone's born exactly alike, but it's the potential, whether we develop it or not. ולא יראו, אבל אם יעזבו את המוכן במזגו למעלה מזו, ולא ילמדו כל עיקר, ולא יעוררו שום כוח בו, סופו שיישאר בר. He'll end up being a boor. If somebody never develops that, they can have the potential for great intellectual pursuits. וכן אם ילמדו וישכילו אדם שהוא גס מטבעו. But you do send someone to learn, even if they are gas mitivo, even if their nature is not to be so sharp. Rav harativut sofo sheyedav yavin. They could still understand and get some places. Avo bikoshi ubetorach. Still, it could be more difficult for them and harder for them. And therefore, and he goes in the same thing with all these things. Someone who is more what he calls libo cham yoter. There's more of a chamimut, more of a passionate personality. Could be more. It's easier for them to be brave. They have the potential. If you'll learn to be a warrior or a soldier, it'll come easy for him. The ishacher shemezek libo kar, with a colder mezeg, colder, so to speak, not that passion or strength in that way or potential in that way. He will be more. His natural way will be more to learn the other direction, to be more timid. Or afraid and less confident in that way. And that's the first thing he says. And he says, he says this is a basic to believe in the Torah. He said this is something which the Torah believes, and there is heskem, there is agreement between the Torah and the Greek philosophers. He says, lahavdil, he says on this point, that a person has choice. If a person would be forced to be a certain way, you can't command someone on something which they don't have a choice on. It would be cruel. It wouldn't make sense. It would be illogical for me to command someone and tell you I'm going to reward you if you do it and punish you if you don't do it, if you don't have a choice. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. That's why, by the way, the Rambam doesn't deal with this here. There are a number of mitzvos in the Torah which seem like there's something which we don't have control over. Don't be afraid when you go into battle. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the convert. All of these mitzvos, which seems to be mitzvos of the heart or even of the mind, believe this. I can tell you believe this, but I can't. Can I make you believe it? I can tell you love me. You must love your father. Either you do or you don't. So even in those mitzvos, we have to, and I think we've talked about this before, understand them, and they are understood in ways by Chazal and certainly by the Mefarshei and Monei HaMitzvot, that they somehow relate to things which we have control over. One of the 10 commandments, lo tachmod. Lo tachmod, don't act upon it. Don't do something. One can make the argument, some Rishonim talk about that even that one can control the way we feel. One can do things to control even the way we desire things. But certainly it's understood more conventionally in not to do things, not to act upon them. And therefore he says, if everything is preordained and we don't have choice, why would one learn? Why would one learn knowledge? Why would one learn a trade? It's a person doesn't have a choice. For those who think this, if he doesn't go into this business or do this or doesn't have this kind of personality, if it's all preordained and God decides or the stars decide what kind of person I'll be and what I'll do and all these things that I'll have, then why I'll just sit back and say, bring it on. Why should I do anything? The whole idea of reward and punishment would be a travesty. Why would you punish? Why would you this? Reuven kills Shimon. Shimon kills Reuven. How can you go there? You're going to punish me? I decided that Reuven should die. God decides these things. So how can you punish me? So the Rambam says it's a basic belief that one has to believe that everything is up to choice. We have choice, and he brings proofs from the Torah. He said, "Ra'ayot lebechirot min haTorah, ra'iti re'ei nasati lefnecha hayom et hachayim ve'et hatov, uvacharta b'chayim, im shama'at tishma'u, im lo tishma'u, v'limadetem otam b'dmeiechem." And if there's no sense in improving ourselves and teaching our children, then why? So all of these things are choice. It's a basic belief that we have bechira chofshit. If that's the case, and the Rambam tackles, again, there are philosophical issues that we could spend a year on easily with all that's been written on the issues and how we understand bechira chofshit and how we deal with the issues. I want to deal very briefly with what the Rambam deals with here in bechira chofshit. He says a number of important things. I'm not gonna. You'll forgive me because time is. I'm gonna not read this, but it's all available. Maybe I'll read some of it, but I'm gonna just try to go through some of what he says. Number one, There are times when the Torah says, this will happen. You will go into Galus for 400 years. God says you're going to get into Israel, Vinoshantem, and you will sin to God, and God will send you into the Galus, the whole Tochacha. The Rambam doesn't, the way the Rambam understands this in brief is he says, it doesn't say who's going to do this. It doesn't say when it's going to happen. Every Mitzri had a choice. That's what he says. Every Mitzri had a choice whether to do this or not to do this, whether to oppress the Jews and not to oppress the Jews. Nobody was forced to do it. Now, I want to deal with Paro because Paro was an exception. But before that, he says, God created the world where Bigadol, listen, we say God runs the world. And this is one of the things I don't understand this all. I don't know if anyone here understands it all, obviously. God has direction and God has the plan. And that somehow does not take away from my bechira chofshit and my personal responsibility. And that's really the thrust of what the Rambam's saying here. God creates a world where certain things happen. The Rambam, I'm not going to read it here, but he says here, he is sholel. He negates those who say that every single time that when God says that somebody picks up something and it's going to fall down, it's not because God decides now that it's going to go down, or that I light a fire, the fire rises up. It's not because God decides, points his hand and says, this is going to happen now. God builds a world with rules, and things work according to those rules. God built those things into nature. Can God change nature? Yeah, we talk about the things that God, Misheshes Yemei Bereshis, that he instilled or put into nature from the very beginning, which are going to be changes in the natural order. There were changes in the natural order, which God could do. God can always make a change in the natural order. But as a rule, he says, God sets up things to happen, and he has the plan, the big plan, how things are going to happen. But it doesn't mean that each individual, that means I have to do this. It says the Jews are going to sin. It's going to happen. That the Jews are going to be comfortable in the land, and God, because he's God, says, this is what's going to happen. Was there a gzera that this Jew is going to have to be Oved Avodah Zarah, or that Jew is going to be Oved Avodah Zarah? No. That would mean that there's no Bechira Chavshit, and there has to be. It's a basic understanding that there must be Bechira Chavshit. Without Bechira Chavshit, there's not personal responsibility. And the Rambam here talks about personal responsibility. Now, there are times, and he says it, the Rambam, he says here, there are times when a person's Bechira Chavshit will be taken away from them. And his example of that, his prime example of that, is Paro. He says Paro lost his ability to have Bechira Chavshit. Part of his punishment, both Paro and Sichon, that there's a Meniyah Hatshuva Ka'onesh. The Chizakti at Lev Paro seems to go against. God says, I will harden Paro's heart. I hardened Paro's heart because he got to a point and he sinned so much that part of his punishment was that now he is not going to be able to do tshuva. He is going to be an instrument. I will use him as an instrument in this world as I want to use him, says God. And the same thing with Sichon. In the same way, it says that sometimes God will be monea from someone the ability to tshuva as a punishment, but not as the natural order is bechira chavshit, is personal responsibility, is a person has the choice to make. And only under certain very specific cases does God do that. And that's what God did to Paro, and that's what God did to Sichon, and that's when God will make a decision to remove someone's bechira chavshit. There are other mefarshim who learn and explain this differently than the Rambam, who explain what happened to Paro in a different way. But this is the Rambam's approach, that Paro did something that he merited, he warranted the removal of his bechira chavshit. The final thing that he talks about in this perek, which he explains, which is super important, he explains it here, he also explains it in Mishnah Torah he talks about, and that's the paradox of Yidiyah and Bechira. That if God knows everything, how can I have free choice? A basic problem which the philosophers have grappled with over the years is if I know what you're going to do, how can I say you have free choice? How can you have free choice? I know whether you're going to go to the makolet today. I know it. I'm going to write it down on this piece of paper, whether you're going to the makolet today. I put the piece of paper in my pocket, whether you're going to the makolet today. Do you really have choice to go? It's already in my pocket that you're going to the makolet today. It's hard to tell me that you have free choice. There are those who want to explain again. This is not even a survey of the opinions. I'm talking about the Rambam here. Those who want to talk about an illusion of free choice, the Rambam rejects that. He does not talk about an illusion of free choice. The Rambam says the problem with the example of you going to the makolet is in our knowledge, there can't be free. If I know what you're going to do, you can't have free choice. But if God knows what you're going to do, you can have free choice. Because, and again, I'll say the words, and the Rambam says it. The Rambam says we could say these words, but we really can't understand it. And he says it's foolish. He goes on here and says, people who think they can understand the nature of God are fools. And if we, lo machshavotai machshavotechem, v'lo darkechem dirachai. And if somebody thinks that they can understand, I can't understand how a being can exist without any physicality. I can't comprehend such a thing because I'm in a physical world. I'm a physical being. I can't. So how can I comprehend God's knowledge and how God knows things? But here's the words the Rambam says, just for the words that we can say. God's knowledge of what happens does not come from the outside. Our knowledge comes from the outside. God's knowledge comes from himself. Hu v'yediato echad. He and his knowledge are one. That's the language of the Rambam. Me, ani v'yediati, it's not one. I know what happened because I see what's happening on the other side of this wall. I hear it, I read it, I know it from some source outside of myself. I can reason something, it can still be true even if I don't exist. God and his knowledge, and again, do I really understand what this means? How can I really understand what this means? But you can understand that God does not know things. He knows these things because he knows himself. He and his knowledge are one. And that's what he says here in these last few paragraphs here. He talks about Yediato, it's not Shuhu v'yediato v'hu is one. V'inyan ze tamua nifla. This is a wondrous thing. V'hu asher ne'elam mehem ve'avadu kehem yad'u shemetziuto yitbarach shmo miuchedet lo tusag. It can't be understood. And they still want to understand him. They can't understand him, but they want to understand how he knows things. V'zeh davar she'ei efshar. God's knowledge comes from self-knowledge, from his own self. He and his knowledge are one, and therefore it's not a stira, it's not a contradiction that he knows something which did not, which you didn't do yet, and it's not a stira between that and you having or me having complete free choice. The Rambam, our time is short, and I know I just want to. He ends this, and what he says is so significant. And this is really what this parak is so significant because he says at the end, Hayotze mikol masha amarno. The Rambam says here at the end of the Shmona Perakim, he ends with, Shema'aseh ha'adam misurim lo. That our actions are given to us. Urbishuto, and it's an our reshut lios tzaddik or rasha. And that's all including Hakol Bidei Shamayim Chutz Miyirat Shamayim. Hakol Bidei Shamayim is if I'm going to be tall or short or this, or it's going to be good crops or bad crops. That's Hakol Bidei Shamayim. But anything I do which is connected to me being a tzaddik or a rasha, which is any actions which I do in this world, which I make a decision on, Ein Elokim Kofehu. God is not forcing me, Be'echad Mishnei Amatzavim. And therefore, therefore, that puts on us the onus, the responsibility to learn, to prepare ourselves, hagemul v'ha'onesh, and to take the outcomes and the hashlachot of our actions in terms of punishment or reward. The enk shayim b'chol zeh. There's no v'amnam tiur yediatoyit barach v'hasagato, understanding his knowledge at kol dvarim harehu lema'ala misichlenu. It's beyond us. V'zeh kol ma shekivunu lahagia elav b'sha'ar hazeh. This is what I wanted to. This is the high point of what I wanted to get to in these Shmona Prakim. Ukvar higia hasha'ah. It come the time she'afsik hadvarim kan va'atchil, and I will begin the Perush Masechet. So when I begin my commentary on Maseches Avos Asher Kedamnu La B'Prakim Elu, that this introduction was for this, and he ends on this note, which is so significant, that we are responsible, that we are, it's interesting because a lot I've heard and read about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, since again, I read some stuff of his, but I can't say I was a big reader or listener or not a student of his in any way. But this seemed to be a theme which he stressed very often from what I've heard and read lately. And it's so, and the Rambam is saying this so clearly, the theme of personal responsibility, that we are, if you think about it, we teach our children, what's the most important lesson? Whenever I'd have a parent in a school who'd get involved, the kid got into trouble, the kid got a detention, the kid got this, the kid got 5 points off on a test, and the parent would come in and stomping and yelling, and it's not fair, and it's not this. And I'd say, maybe you're right. Nobody wants to see their kid not treated well. But we want to teach our children, above all, personal responsibility. What's a more valuable lesson that we could teach them? And I used to say to him, you do the crime, you do the time. You take certain actions, there are repercussions, there are consequences. And taking responsibility for those consequences is really what's so significant. We come to the parsha of Vayigash Elav Yehuda, where Yehuda, who epitomizes being Malchut. Why was Yehuda zochet to Malchut? Yehuda took responsibility. He took responsibility. He stepped up to the plate. I'm responsible for Yosef here. I'm getting in the thick of things. Nachshon ben Aminadav, the Matei Yehuda, who said, we want to leave Egypt. We want to get out of the Yam Suf. We have to take a step. We have to show that we trust in God. We're going to go in. Yehuda had that, and the first thing we see from Yehuda is personal, not just responsibility for others, but responsibility for others begins with responsibility for ourselves. And when Yehuda, with the story of Tamar, where he said, Tzadka mimeni, I messed up here. She's right. I'm wrong. I need to take responsibility. That stuff, it's my stuff. I did it. I'm wrong. She's right. I'm wrong. That midah of being able to own up, to fess up, to take that responsibility is what the Rambam is talking about here. That this is really, and without waxing too much about going, you see, I'll just take 2 moments. I've said it before, maybe. The first murder in history was Cain killed Hevel. And Cain killed Hevel, everyone says, because of jealousy. God accepted Hevel's korban and not Cain's korban. I say it slightly differently. Cain killed Hevel because of self-pity. Nebuch on me. I worked so hard. I brought the korban first, and God rejected my korban. And because I feel self-pity, that justifies everything. I can go and I can, it justifies murder because I got messed over. And if I got messed over, I'm gonna do whatever it takes to make it right. And this is the lesson of Cain's killing Hevel. And this is the lesson which the Rambam is talking about here, the lesson of responsibility. And unfortunately, we live in a generation, all we need to do is read the newspapers, where it's everybody's fault. That if this person's there, that this person, it's always somebody's fault. Somebody's to blame. Generally, the white man is to blame, but we won't get political here. but somebody's to blame for something which happened. And this lesson which the Rambam is talking about here is antithetical. It's a lesson of responsibility. We have bechira. We have to take responsibility because ultimately we have to own the consequences. It's good to see everybody. I see Rav Ruvain is here. Hi, Rav Ruvain. I'll
Thank you.
say goodbye. Wish
Thank
everyone a
you.
very good week.
Thank you.
Sei gesund.